Patrolling the neighbourhood with a mobility scooter doesn't sound very effective, but former cop Jim says he has no other choice because of drug use in his public housing estate, and these residents aren't alone.
It's got to a point where living in a dumping ground for drug dealers and scum, and it's not good enough.
Meet Jim Carroll, a former cop now on a crusade to clean up his neighbourhood.
I've had 3 death threats. I've had to hide my medication in the washing machine. That's how bad that's got.
Jim and his elderly neighbours live in public housing. They say antisocial behaviour has left them living in fear.
Is this your last line of defence?
That's it. That's the only thing that's going to stop me from being killed.
And it seems the problem isn't confined to Jim's housing block either. A Current Affair has spoken to pensioners right across the country who say this scenario has become all too familiar. But tonight, they're fighting back. And finally, they're being heard.
The problem is massive. It's not going to go away without some real level of intervention and leadership.
I have a double lock. I have a deadlock chain to maybe save the door from being totally opened.
Ian Mayer has lived in this public housing tower in Sydney's inner west for more than 15 years. Today, he's showing us some of the things he has to deal with on a daily basis.
The door has been damaged, jimmied open, so the junkies can get in there and use it as a shooting gallery.
Ian says fear has driven him from his home. And can you blame him? Trashed houses, theft, drug use and violence. This is what elderly tenants are living with every day.
You have to contend with the junkies. They're off their phases. I've had my door kicked in.
Crime tends to be committed by the young, and when you mix the young and the elderly, you're going to create a problem.
David Chalk is a social analyst.
The fear factor is extraordinary. The elderly, because they're frail, feel vulnerable, they feel they're open to assault.
I'm too frightened to go out of the place. I sit here all day and read.
84-year-old Faye lives a few doors up from Jim at this public housing estate in Wodonga in Victoria's northeast. This complex used to house only people aged 55 years and over, but that changed a few years ago. And Faye says that's when the trouble started.
Got to lock both my doors all the time. And I never had to do that before because it was so lovely here.
The pensioner claims she regularly finds syringes in the garden.
There was a cup from the Nescafe coffee tins. It was full to the top.
Full of needles.
Across the courtyard, Faye's neighbour Joanne says she's also scared to leave her home.
One of them came out of his unit and sort of ran down the pathway. He had a tomahawk axe in his hand.
The grandmother says she feels defenceless and vulnerable.
It's terrifying. This is happening at all hours of the day.
We would get 3 or 4 calls a week in relation to people in, over 55s estates and difficulties that they're having with some of their neighbours. They're noisy and drug use.
Mark Finane is Executive Officer of the Victorian Public Tenants Association. He says a lack of funding is largely to blame.
There's just not the options to be able to transfer people to different environments, to different circumstances.
A recent report shows New South Wales spends the most on social housing each year. That's compared to Victoria, which spends just $530 million. The Western Australian government allocates around $829 million, South Australia spends $323 million, and the Queensland government's annual expenditure averages $628 million. Mark believes a national housing strategy needs to be developed to bring all states and territories in line and help solve some of the issues we're seeing.
It's not a case of just add water and you've got housing. It's a long-term strategy to build one house. Imagine 1,000, imagine 60,000, imagine 500,000, because that's kind of getting up towards the need that we're talking about for the next 20 years in Australia.
This is my home. I shouldn't have to move. And not at my age. And not when I've been here 29 years. No.
For now, Jim has taken to patrolling the neighbourhood on his mobile scooter, making sure his elderly neighbours feel safe.
I do this at least once a day, and if there's people hanging around, probably 2 or 3 times.
And do you feel a responsibility to the other residents
I feel responsible
here?
for the older ladies here that can't look after themselves.
Once a cop, always a cop.
Once a cop, always a cop.
You'll find a statement from the Minister for Social Services on our website.